Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Ruby Rogues. I'm David Kimura, and today on our panel we have John Epperson.
Hello.
And we have a special guest, Ian Norris.
Hello.
Resolve Digital helps build, optimize, and maintain e-commerce, SaaS, and other products built on Ruby on Rails. They can help build new applications from scratch, rescue projects in bad shape, provide ongoing development and maintenance for existing projects, augment your existing team with experienced Rails developers. They also specialize in Solidus and Spree commerce solutions. Go check them out at resolve.digital.
So Ian, can you tell us a bit about yourself and who you work for, what you're doing, and why you're famous and all that good stuff?
I don't know about famous, but I can talk about the other things. I am a senior software engineer at a BackerKit right now, which basically helps out with like crowdfunding platforms do fulfillment, and been enjoying my work there. Actually have a cats game I've been working on too, where I have a little bit of code for that. And then how I ended up here was I did a lightning talk at RubyConf around pair programming and some solutions for the problems that you often see when you're pairing.
Cool. Well, I think this could be a great topic because it's something where I think in the past 10 years or 10 years ago, pair programming wasn't even really a thing. It's not something that we thought about. You know, if we had a question, you just go on Expert Exchange and, you try to find an answer only to not find anything. So you might ask a senior person and then they just shoot you back a book or an article or they just give you the answer. So can you explain what pair programming is and kind of what it looks like?
Yeah, so pair programming is when you have like two developers usually working together to write code together, actually, like not rather than like, pull requests or like review. That code review is like another way of having people check your code. But think of it as like you're continuously checking each other's code and writing it together. Usually, preferably with two different, like each person having equal access to the machine. So like two sets of keyboards and two monitors is like an ideal setup, but there are other ways of doing it. And you kind of take turns using like who somebody's typing and someone else is kind of thinking about what's going on or helping check what you're writing. And you're just going back and forth. And there's a bunch of different ways of doing it, but that's kind of like the general gist of it.
All right. So in a idealistic world, how would that really play out? So would you have both people typing at the same time or just one person type at a time? Because I know, for example, with a lot of editors nowadays with VS Code, with Atom, they have a pair session where you can actually be working off of your own computer with your own extensions. So if you prefer Vim shortcuts, but someone else prefers Sublime Text shortcuts, you can still use all of those, but then you're still kind of sharing the same session, the same code base.
That is interesting because I think if you can get that kind of scenario to work well, I think that would be kind of an interesting way to go about it. Because oftentimes, at least when I've been pairing, you kind of just have to settle on having the same environment and the same set. Like, except we're all using RubyMine. It's like nobody's using Vim, but that's kind of cool if you can get if you can get that kind of scenario where you can share between the different monitors or the different machines. I think really what's important is just equal access. So like because like, you're not going to want to type at the same time because that's kind of too much noise. But being able to, I think something ideal about it is being able to know when you're like okay, it's time. I'm going to go ahead and drive now. I'm going to go ahead and like be the one that's kind of typing and thinking about like the nitty gritty of what's going on versus I'm going to be the one to take a step back and let the other person try and solve things for a bit. I think kind of helps. Like having an established back and forth, because I think probably like most where it's not great is where like you have somebody kind of hogging the machine and like doing all the work basically or trying to do all the work, maybe not even realizing that's what they're doing. And so being able to have that back and forth cadence in some fashion is kind of where I think it's ideal. And if that involves bindings, that would be great. But sometimes that's not always possible.
So you've been doing this for a long time. You say that you've been doing it like most of your career, according to your talk.
Yeah.
Have you always done it the same way? I mean, I assume that you've experienced multiple kinds of pair programming. I myself have done some over the years, right? And I highly value it as a tool in my chest. It's not my primary technique, right?
Mm-hmm.
I assume that you've experienced like a lot of bad and good things. Like, can you talk through like different things that you've encountered? And like, how are they different from this ideal, right?
So like I started at ThoughtWorks and we're basically like XP and Agile and like pair programming were kind of like the bread and butter of like ThoughtWorks. there I kind of got experiences, like kind of some good experiences about like what ideal scenarios were when I was starting out training. And then, but then going into like the consultancy world, right? You're trying to get people to think about pair programming that are level up developers who that don't necessarily want to be brought along that journey. I've definitely seen examples of like that they don't like they're not contributing anything, or they're being very resistant and like only wanting to like taking control of the machine and not giving the other person space to type. Oftentimes something I've seen is like senior developers not giving junior developers the space to actually code things out. There was one example where I was working at a healthcare company, and I was like, oh, I love this developer. I love pairing with him. Like I learned so much from him. And then I would like talk to other junior developers on the team, and they were terrified of pairing with him because he would just kind of bowl over them and not like I would be debating with him and working like trying to learn from him, but other people I think didn't see that they had that space and had a terrible experience in contrast. And
Yeah.
definitely, like the senior junior dynamic is something you kind of have to watch out for, where I think that can lead to a bad experience. And also, if you don't have like the right remote setup, it can be really obnoxious to try and do remote pairing, especially like if you're trying like doing sessions over Zoom. I've not enjoyed that experience or similar. Like Tuple, I think is kind of where things are a lot better. That's what we do because we have one fully remote dev on my current team at BackerKit. That's actually been working pretty smoothly because it's like basically the old Screen Hero or the new Screen Hero. I mean,
Yeah, I've heard a lot in recent weeks about Tuple.
and let me think of some other stories that other non-ideals. I think I at least a personal struggle for me has been around CSS and HTML, and when you're pairing, like because if you're doing because like I've only been in full-time pairing shops, and that can be kind of like when you're doing like some more nitty-gritty things or things that are a little more rote, because like not all coder writing is like the nice shiny new thing. I had a situation where I just asked the pair very clearly cared about like proper CSS styling and having the design look as close as possible. And I'm like 80% of the way there. That's good enough, and I'm going to move on. And so the tension of just like, hey, I'm going to go check out for a bit. You can finish this out, but I'm not in the headspace for it. And it's just kind of interesting to think about that as another like a non-ideal scenario where if like somebody is having trouble following along, they can often check out.
That makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense.
So I'd like to take a step back and just kind of discuss some of the advantages over pair programming versus the traditional way of each person works on their own story. Can you talk to that a bit, Ian?
Yeah, so I think some of the advantages is like there's a lot less need for code review because you're kind of code reviewing all the time, and so you're not kind of like oftentimes, like if I've had to solo, I've kind of been annoyed by the fact that I have to kind of follow up with developers and chase them down because like right, they want to be doing work, they don't want to have to be reviewing other people's work. They're wanting to just do their own code. And when you're pairing, you have less of that concern because you always have two people reviewing each piece of code you're shipping. And another thing I really like is with regards to it stops because everyone has their own different like a perspective on how they're coming across code, but be that like I'm gonna like try and craft the perfect piece of code and ship it out versus like I'm just gonna bang out the simplest thing that works and just ship it out, and it might be a pain to refactor later. And you can kind of balance those tensions with like having a pair, because if you're somebody that likes to like spend their time writing the perfect piece of code, you have to be able to convince the other person that this is the necessary thing to do at the time, and vice versa. And so like having that it's kind of adds like an additional checks and balances in terms of keeping on task.
And so, how's the efficiency? Because there is a level of throughput with pairing that could either increase or decrease depending on the situation.
Yeah, it's interesting because oftentimes that's like a misconception. I think that like, oh, like, if you're putting two developers instead of one, so really if I split those two developers up, I get twice as much work done. That might be technically true at the beginning, or if the tasks are really like basic and mundane, perhaps that could be true. But as you're developing more complex software and you're adding stuff like, and oftentimes, right, so developers are working with like code that they haven't written before. They haven't fully written all of it. They've only written part of it, and they're contributing or tweaking or augmenting it. And those kind of situations, it's I feel like that's where you actually get a lot faster with pair programming, because you can bring other people, like somebody, instead of one person having not that knowledge of that part of the code base, everyone kind of gets knowledge of that part of the code base, because you're kind of having to share it between people, and having different people, like different pair, especially as you start rotating frequently, then you can kind of get different people's knowledge split across the team. And also just, yeah, the leveling up capacity of to being able to pair a senior with a junior dev really just helps people become more able to do tasks on their own than they would before.
Yeah. So let's take a scenario where you have a product and you have 10 developers on this product. You have 5 seniors and maybe 5 juniors, and none of the 10 people have ever seen the code before. And you're always pairing a senior developer with a junior developer, rotating in and out each day. So I think initially, as you go through your backlog of stories, bug fixes, new features, you're going to get a lot of benefit from pair programming. You're basically creating a sea of knowledge wealth between everyone equally that are, at least those that are grasping the concepts. And so I think that pair programming can be a huge payoff. But what about a situation where you have these same 5 developers and 5 juniors maybe on a program that now they've been working on this for 2 or 3 years. So everyone has this same shared knowledge about the application and what to do. Then is it time to step back from pair programming and to go back to the more traditional code reviews at the end of a story completion?
I don't necessarily think so. And the reason why I would argue for that is when you're soloing, you still need to have somebody review your code, right? Like you're not going to just like have people just ship code independently and without any kind of review. So you still have the cost, like there's still the cost of reviewing the code. You're just kind of making it a continuous cost as opposed to like a fixed cost at the end of a day or at the end of the week, kind of thing. And another thing is being able to like kind of because like designing together, I think is something like you have to kind of budget that time for design, and either you're designing up front and then hoping that everyone agrees on that shared vision, or you're continuously building together. I guess a situation where maybe pairing I think might not be as ideal is like if you have a fully remote team. I'm still kind of like have my doubts about whether a fully remote team could really leverage pairing to like the ability where you get enough benefit versus negative. And then also, yeah, if you have like a lot of junior, like if your junior density is pretty high, or in a situation where you're still like needing to do a lot of exploration, where like you don't know, where you also are trying to like learn new technologies. Learning new technologies tends to not be a great thing to do while pairing because you're like trying to read documentation together. It's not really something I consider ideal.
So, assuming that I buy into pair programming as being awesome, can you talk about maybe what it looks like or how I can get off the rails, like go to a bad path, right? And maybe what the good path looks more like. Can you distinguish a little bit there? Maybe let's start with the bad path first. Like, what are some things that I can do that'll make me give up on it?
I think some things that often cause people to give up on it is if you're in a situation where only one person can really have access to the machine, or if you're like if you're like sharing a laptop, or otherwise in a scenario where it facilitates one person hogging the computer. Oftentimes you can kind of feel like you're a backseat driver rather than like a driver navigator, and I think that kind of contributes a lot to people not wanting to pair. I think another thing is not being heard in the conversation. Having the space to be able to give feedback to your pair is kind of important. And if you're not in an work environment where that's possible, I don't think that pairing would be a good place for that environment. Because being able to correct through feedback is kind of like a really critical thing. That also is another reason why I would say pairing, like in that 5-5 situation, you would still want it because you would get that feedback more continuously.
By correcting through feedback, do you mean like because I'm hogging the computer, you need to give me feedback on that, or do you mean feedback
Yeah,
on my
so
code
like
itself, or both?
both. I think one great example is I definitely had the hogging computer problem for a bit, and I had a junior I was working with actually would just hand over the dog. Like she had a dog with her, and she would just hand the dog, be like, "Pet the dog, Ian." And that was kind of like a reminder to like, okay, like let's take a step back and let, like, even though it's like it can be a real struggle to want to finish, like how to solve the problem and you're waiting for the other person to figure it out, being able to give the juniors that space is a really critical thing.
Can you talk through that specifically a little bit more?
It comes a lot with one fascinating problem when you're pairing, right? Is you might like somebody might be typoing, or someone might be like they might be running into like the wall they're about to hit. They're about to fail this test in a way that like you see coming, and you could choose to like intervene ahead of time. And sometimes you just need to get work done, so you do intervene ahead because you're always balancing that. But sometimes you do just need to let them hit that wall and like struggle a little bit before you, so that they can feel that pain before you suggest, hey, actually I think dependency injection might be a better solution to this, or I think your mocks might be in the wrong way. And just being able to like, because like being able to, rather than just introducing that concept before they understood the problem needs to be solved, I think it's a more advanced pairing technique. But I think it's something that once you can feel comfortable to have that space, that it allows for a lot more growth.
Yeah, and I think that even in shops that don't do pairing per se as a standard, we all pair to some degree. For example, whenever I would create a new feature or a new feature was requested, the developers, we would get together and kind of just hash through its architecture. Like, what's the end result going to look like? What kind of structure are we wanting? What kind of database schema changes are we going to make? And kind of talk through all the things like that. But we wouldn't actually do the pairing because, a lot of it can just be bootstrapping and pointless work. Not pointless, but just tedious work.
Yeah. And I think I agree that definitely like during the setup process of some projects, and there are definitely times in a project where if like, because there are not like pointless, but like you're right, like there's infrastructure set up, or there's like the conventions and stuff that you kind of have to set up in a new project, or in like the first phase of a project. And that may be indeed a time where I might agree that, okay, let's split. Like oftentimes when in those kind of situations in a full-time pairing environment, that's when I'm like, hey, can we just split up and divide and conquer for a bit? We just need to, like, we're upgrading from Rails 4 to Rails 5, and a bunch of just these tests are failing, and we know exactly, we just have to copy paste fix all of these tests. But like, you take this half and I'll take this half. Being explicit about when there's like a situation like that, I think and I think it's totally fair to be that, like, that's not a situation where pairing necessarily gives you the benefit that you want.
There's also another scenario which I kind of was thinking as Dave was kind of talking, which is maybe you have a new feature or something that's a little larger than some others, right? Or it's kind of like a new, I don't know, a module or a new place in the app
Yeah.
altogether, right? And you're just kind of discussing this new thing. And so you all get up on the whiteboard together, maybe draw out what your schema is, yap, about how you think you're going to solve it, stuff like that, right? For a while. Does that look the same in a pairing environment? Is that something that you do as well? Or does it look different because you're pairing? And so,
I think it can look very similar. I oftentimes do make sure that there's like a whiteboard accessible for we start like trying to go into the nitty gritty, and we realize we need to take a step back and think about the architecture for a second, so that we can at least have a shared understanding of the architecture we want to go towards. And definitely, I think there's still room and space for the like, even in I like adult, like when we were dealing with like the healthcare and like adding new features, there would definitely still be need for like, okay, actually I think this is something where we need everyone to be on board with this. Let's have a meeting to like hash it out for like 30 minutes.
okay, that seems reasonably similar.
Yeah, it's very similar.
So there's definitely some pitfalls to me. So I've used pair programming in the past, right, as kind of like okay, maybe this particular thing is harder, or I specifically know we're tackling this one problem and I know it's going to be tough. And so I'm going to have to go through a lot of explanation and code review. And maybe I just want to have somebody with me the whole time, right? So that we can both agree on a thing, right? So I found it a useful technique for that. But I've blundered through it in the past, right? And you actually list a number of techniques here. Can you talk about like good ways to do this,
Yeah, and I
and
think
why you might pick one?
my preferred way currently is ping pong pairing, like, because it also helps facilitate test driven development, where basically you write, like, one pair writes a test, and then the other pair solves that test and then writes the next test, and then passes it on to you, who solves that test and then writes the next test, and you kind of go back and forth between that and get into like a rhythm. And I like that because, yeah, right, it makes, by writing the test, having tests first be part of that pairing process, it also facilitates good test driven development, which I love. And also, yeah, it gives an explicit space for when, like, a lot of the techniques are around like, when am I switching, and being like more explicit about that, so that way there's less of a concern that like keyboard hacking is occurring.
Do you feel like that gives you good momentum?
I often feel like it does when it's possible. There's definitely like situations where it's not possible, and so then we have to kind of pick a different strategy. Also, remote, I feel like ping pong doesn't work as well, and I end up having to settle for driver navigator in remote with like an explicit. Okay, we're gonna switch from sharing from your machine to my machine in like an hour.
Okay.
Yeah, and egg timers are something else that I found are very useful for when you're doing so. Driver navigator being, driver being the person who's like actually executing executing and writing the code, and the navigator being the person that's looking for high level concerns or pointing out like, oh, hey, you mistyped that, or hey, there's this bug, or there's this issue coming up ahead that we need to think about. And so taking explicit turns between driver and navigator is also useful. So like, hey, there's like an egg timer or some kind of automated time. Like there's a lot of good plugins for that now too, where you can just like switch between, like set it to like notify you as the ping in 30 minutes, so it's not as obnoxious as an egg timer.
Dave, I think you mentioned doing some of this sporadically as well. Like I've used driver navigator techniques pretty much. That's pretty much only been the only pairing technique I've ever used.
Yeah, the techniques I've used in the past were mostly like a divide and conquer. So we would use the extensions of our editor. So both of us were working off of the same computer, essentially. So all the code base was on one computer. And we were able to both be typing at the same time in the same file or within different files. It doesn't matter. And we would just kind of be walking through and talking. And I would even do a split screen where I would follow that developer. So as they're typing or navigating between different files, I would see that on one side of my screen while I'm working on my side. And I found that to be the most efficient way, because that way we're both getting our full throughput of getting the coding done. But then also we were able to talk about things on like, hey, by the way, what about this situation? Or how should we handle this use case? And I found that to be more efficient when you had essentially two mid levels or two senior levels pairing together. But I think in a junior slash senior pairing level, then it is going to be more important to have a driver navigator style.
Ian, does that fit any of the things that you?
I think that does fit a lot of the things, because especially you can like, I find the structure I think is definitely like more useful in a specific environment. Like like if you have a junior dynamic or a junior senior dynamic, that's where I think having very explicit structure is useful as kind of like guardrails. Whereas like in a senior situation or a mid situation, I've found that you can be a little more informal. Yeah, being able to like that kind of divide and conquer technique. I haven't used that before, but that kind of sounds similar to feeling a little more loosey goosey about like, okay, yeah, we're almost ping ponging, but we're like being a little more liberal about who's on the keyboard right now, because we're just kind of like talking through this together rather than, and that we can see that. I think that's kind of similar.
Yeah, it struck me that way too, right? That it's more like two people working right next to each other, which is its own kind of value. There was one last technique that you mentioned on here, Safari. Can you talk through that as well?
Yeah, so I think there can be situations where somebody has done some pre-work or has like more of the domain knowledge, and being kind of explicit about like, I'm just going to take you a tour through the code, and you're kind of going to be more like just on this journey with me, rather than it being like a little more directed than like say a driver navigator, where you're hopefully trying to like work together on the problem, and somebody's more like, I'm dragging you along for a bit so that you can catch up.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense.
And if you're explicit about that, that can be a good technique for like helping, like even in a senior situation, for someone who's like, I'm not familiar with this part of the code base, and can you help me like get me up to speed?
Yeah, I feel like that's I mean, I've definitely used a similar technique, right? I've used, and it's been used with me for, okay, I'm getting onto a new project, or somebody else is coming onto a new project, and we're just talking through it with each other. So makes sense. We didn't call that pairing, but okay.
I think my main aversion to pair programming is that it is a tool. It's a tool for multiple people to come together and to solve a singular task. But I think in organizations where they only do pair programming, then they are misusing the tools. I think that there are some tasks which should be marked as this is a pair programming task, and other tasks should be a solo task where no other outside involvement other than a code review is needed.
Yeah, and I do think that there's definitely tasks that should be explicitly marked that way. I think one thing I've seen in the past is around when you're like researching or explicit research, like spiking as sometimes it's called, and that you when you have like that kind of work explicitly set out, that you're comfortable that one person's going to take it and come back with results about what they found out with their research. Or oftentimes there's a lot of like at BackerKit, we do a lot of one-off tasks for customer requests, and oftentimes those were explicitly like, hey, we don't need two people to sign off on like doing this routine chore. Go ahead and like, yeah, just these are like the person who's solo can go crank out.
So it sounds like you do sort of have division amongst yourselves, but maybe you default to pair programming is kind of what it sounds like.
Yeah, it's like we prefer pairing on like new work or on feature work, but there's definitely an explicit like there are things that do need to be done, like bugs troubleshooting, like where the like yeah, because those are I was thinking of other examples where I think there's not a lot of value in pairing. Yeah, when you have stuff like customer requests that are like one-off, like you like are not writing any new code, but you're like just doing some console jockeying to get something done, or bug hunting, or like reviewing through bugs and trying to like figure out what's going on. Those tend to not. I don't think you get a lot. Usually, you don't get a lot of value out of that.
Hey folks, this is Charles Max Wood, and I just launched my book, The Max Coder's Guide to Finding Your Dream Developer Job. It's up on Amazon. We self-published it. I would love your support. If you want to go check it out, you can find it there, The Max Coder's Guide to Finding Your Dream Developer Job. Have a good one. Max out.
So since we're having this value conversation, you also discuss a little bit about mob programming in your prep notes. Can you talk about that and maybe how it either breaks the value mold or whether it's good?
Yeah, I think mobbing used sparingly can be pretty useful. It's mostly in like a learning. Like it's definitely not like you're not getting. It's oftentimes you're not going to get a lot of work done parent mob programming because you're just too many developers in the room for that to be possible. But as like a learning tool to kind of just like see different to understand people's different styles like in a whole room and see how it all stitches together. We've been kind of like taking like a feature that's already been done or a feature maybe that we want to do some group refactoring and just kind of like cutting aside like an hour or two in like a month and like doing a mob like a facilitated mob programming. I think in an environment where you have like you definitely need a facilitator though because like otherwise like you're not going to get anything done or on keep on task because there's too many voices in the room. But you can I think mobbing as in like let's like review this together or like come to a shared understanding about a topic I think can be a useful thing.
So does that mean that you feel like the experiment is yielding results then?
Yep.
Like that it's working in certain ways?
In certain ways, in terms of like helping understand people's thought processes and like being able to expose people to like a different way of thinking about a certain problem or about exploring a topic. I think, but I've also seen situations where it hasn't worked, where there's just been too many voices in the room or just kind of things have grinded to a halt and like two people are basically contributing and no one else is.
Interesting. So
Yeah.
Doesn't sound quite as solved. Go ahead, Dave.
One interesting thing about pair programming is that it almost forces you to enhance your soft skills, so to speak. Because if you have problems communicating concisely, clearly to your peer, then you're going to hurt the efficiency of that team. So I think that from that perspective, it does help shape a developer, make them more well-rounded to be able to engage in conversations with other developers on a particular task.
Totally. I definitely feel like that's been a lot of the growth is like, yeah, it's like soft skills, like giving and receiving feedback. I think I've been able like have that as a skill has like really developed over the course of having to pair program for like 7 or 8 years straight. And so that has been kind of like a cool thing to see develop where before I definitely remember like I had ThoughtWorks conversations where people were like, Ian, I'm trying to give you this feedback so you can improve. And like, you're resisting it right now. Like, I'm not telling you this to make you mad. I'm telling you this to make you grow. From there to like now, it's just like, it's like a cool thing to see.
Yeah, I was going to say too, like, I know that it's definitely part of my growth, right? to specifically that sort of social negotiation that you're doing when you're programming with somebody, because it forces you to do it so much all at once. That's really good. Teaching you, maybe, what, it's totally cool that my pair likes to do this, has a different style than I do, right?
Yeah.
You kind of decide which things you really want to fight about and which things you don't, things like that. So yeah, I agree. Like the soft skills thing is pretty awesome.
I think it's also important, and this kind of goes out of the scope of pair programming, but for the particular project that you're working on, to have a definitive set of guidelines for styles. So that way it's not a combat between the two different people pairing, but instead you're following the guidelines. So, use guard clauses instead of a bunch of if statements or something like that, just as a standard practice for this project. Because I can see where you might have two pairs kind of like fighting for the same thing, but two different approaches that are both equally justifiable and equally good, and they both accomplish the same end result, but just two different approaches.
That's definitely an interesting tension, and one way we try and solve that is through like having an explicit meeting once a week, where if there was like an issue that was found during a particular pairing session, that we kind of try and norm on it during like a dev chat discussion with like all the developers on our team, which is only like 4 or 5 or backer kit, but just being able to like have like a team norm basically. Like, for example, we were having like there was a conflict between a pair about we were making a new onboarding flow. One developer was just kind of like, we don't know what's going to happen yet. I'm just going to like throw all of the onboarding routes onto like one or two controllers, like not RESTful at all, because we're just still like in a non-deterministic state. Or the other developer was like, no, I just want to I believe in RESTful routes like basically all the time, and I want to make sure that that's like the standard we're doing. And honestly, I think given the unknowns, I think both routes were relatively equalish in value, but we were able to at least come to some kind of consensus about like, okay, if the pattern had started to emerge this way, let's just continue that pattern, and being able to like and having a good discussion where we acknowledge like, hey, either of these are legitimate, but like let's just, if there's a pattern emerging, just follow that pattern. If that's like there's like a significant reason not to.
I think that's a really interesting story, because I'm actually kind of curious, like, what did you end up doing, right? Like, and how did you sort of how did you make the other guy feel like he was heard, right? Or gal, whoever it was.
The part of it was about like facilitating the discussion and talking, both like enumerating the merits of both approaches, and like the trade-offs that you're making, because right, like everything's about the trade-offs you're making. And in that situation, I think I recognized that like the other person was really passionate about those RESTful routes, and they weren't going to get in the way for now. So just to like, okay, we had started to kind of push that pattern. Let's just go ahead and like continue that pattern for now, and then we can always revisit that if it turns out to be like not if that turns out we need to do something else. And I think being able to acknowledge, but then and there's also been situations with that developer where I've been able to say like, hey, can you suspend your disbelief for a moment? That let's try and like just go down this different route, and we can always like leaving the space for being able to say we can come back to it, or we can make a chore or a story to acknowledge that we need to come back and refactor this later.
Fair enough. So it sounds like it was a difficult thing, but you managed, kind of thing. So in my experience, this kind of thing happens like all the time, right? Where I have beliefs in certain things. Maybe I'm somebody that's like, oh, you know what? I really love service objects. Everything should be a service object, right? I'm not. But, or maybe I have like sort of the opposite bent, so that they shouldn't happen. I actually was less talking about, whether I should have tabs and spaces, though I suppose that's possible. But with those like higher level, more algorithmic level decisions, right? How are you always punting those to the end of the week? Like, I guess maybe I'm more curious, like, how did that pair solve it at the time? Or did they say, we have to wait till Friday to talk about this with the whole group?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in that situation, one of the pairs just deferred to the other pair, and then but then brought it up to revisit it. And I think kind of, as in like they like went with one of the approaches, like the approach of the person, like, and oftentimes I think, and something to watch out for is definitely the more stubborn pair oftentimes wins those discussions, I've noticed.
Yes.
one thing that I have done to help out with that is that I'm a pretty big believer in time boxes, where if you can show me that this solution can work in like 30 minutes to an hour, or et cetera, or like whatever reasonable time box is appropriate, that I can be willing to like try that out and see how that works. And then that leaves me the space to prove like oh, maybe I thought service object wasn't relevant for the situation, but it turned out to actually be really useful. Or no, it just still doesn't feel that way. And then that way you can at least, and that I think gives the space for the other developer to be heard by taking the time to go down that route.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it does take more time to do that as a trade-off, because if you choose to back out of that decision, that means you spend an hour on that. But I think it can be worth it in order to really be able to make sure both developers are heard in the situation.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I was going to say, especially since you brought up the idea of like the more stubborn person like winning most of the time, is my way of solving that has been that whoever sort of like, so there's always somebody like that has the idea, right? There's sort of the positive case.
Yeah.
Whoever is trying to say, oh no, that's a dumb idea, or like sort of the negative case, they have to, I feel like it's sort of like the responsibility of that person to prove, right, why it wouldn't work, or
yeah.
You know what I mean? So I always put the onus there. That's kind of been my thing, but that makes sense. That's actually, it's a thing that I think is dealt with. So you run into that problem in code review too, right? Like that's not just in pairing.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I definitely think it's like half people problem, right? Because like people are attached to ideas that they have, and being able to, if you can disassociate that and start just to focus on the idea and the implementation trade-offs, then I think that can help too. It's definitely a thing in general where you kind of have to just acknowledge where there's trade-offs, or where just whatever is going to be like oftentimes if you have a time constraint that can help too, with like acknowledging like, hey, maybe the solution would be cool if we had the time for it, but we don't. And let's revisit that later.
I think it's also important to note that just because you're pair programming, having more eyes on the same piece of code, that doesn't resolve you from having to scope out requirements for a particular feature, because I've found myself in that situation. So, hypothetical, let's say if you're working on a microservices application in its true form, where you have a bunch of different small projects that all combine work as one, and you have a new feature which warrants a new microservice. Well, what language do you write it in? Do you do it in Go? Do you do it in Python, Ruby, JavaScript, via Node, or what? And I think that leaving those kind of decisions up to a two-pair team is dangerous.
Yeah.
I think those kind of architectural decisions need to happen before that story ever comes down to a pair.
I totally agree with you, and I think decisions like even decisions about like which microservices you're split, how you're choosing to split up, if you're like going down that kind of route, you really do need to have that kind of planned out before. Like I think like the responsibility of the pair, I think, is definitely not about like higher level decisions. I think those definitely, there needs to be a different space for that, and certainly we've had to carve our own space out for that, even on like full time pairing shops. I think another interesting thing you kind of allude to is when making decisions like the language and stuff. I think that really has to be something that's like a team normal, like that's like the organization has made a decision here, and the organization needs to make that call. There's no one else that should be, and it definitely should be enforced as like I'm a big believer in like consistent language and stuff, but like if you're going to give the space for a specific different language to be trying out, that really does need to be vetted at that higher level.
Yeah, I think the division of labor, right, between what is an implementation detail and what is an architectural decision that should happen at a higher level is just a hard problem.
Yeah.
And we sometimes incorrectly distribute the work to the wrong place. That totally happens.
Totally.
Like letting pairs pick their own language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It can be dangerous.
Totally agree. So we've talked a bit about pairing. Are there some things that like we're missing, or anything else that you wanted to jump in?
Oh yeah, I kind of relate. I mean, it was definitely alluded to in like the lightning talk I gave, but yeah, being able to have like a pairing checklist, or having like specific processes that you've agreed upon beforehand, I think can help a lot with those like the emotional situation piece of things. Like we have one at BackerKit, and I've been really happy with like that. It really has helped make sure that pair retros happen, which is I think something that's also really critical for like again all about that feedback loop.
Can you define that really quick?
So a pair retro is like a pair retrospective. Basically, at the end, not every day, but almost every day, we'll check in with each other about like how did the pairing session go, and whether like what were difficult times during that, like when were there pain points during that session, and are there ways that we can avoid those pain points in the future, or like what are the things that we could learn, or were there learning opportunities that were had that we get like learn something from, or oh, we can do this differently next time when we come across this problem.
What does your pairing checklist look like then?
Let me pull it up 1 second here. So it looks like kind of there's like a first like a check-in just feeling wise, just how people are feeling today, like to acknowledge if like somebody's like tired or otherwise not in a situation where they're going to be able to be a full pair. And then agree on the high level goal. What do we want to do? What do we want to get out of today's pairing session? Do we want to get stuff done? Do we want to learn about a new feature or technology? Do we want to learn, give space for learning? And then making sure that there's no planned interruptions, and establish like a specified stop time and leave time for the mini retro at the end. And creating a task list for any of the stories if relevant, and being like like before we just jump right into the story. And then and deciding on pairing style for the day.
Okay. And that seems reasonable to me. As somebody that's always just jumped in the past and kind of pulled it as a tool, I can see some value in actually like planning it out beforehand.
Yeah, I think it just helps with like giving like some it's just kind of mindfulness, right? Because like because again, like right, because a lot of pairing is soft skills as well. I think just having some reminders of some like the specifics of those soft skills can help people who maybe not be in the right mindfulness setup to be refreshed in that. And then for the reflection, there's also some suggestions like how are we feeling about the day is going? What would make the rest of the day 10% better? Yeah, what were pain point like when was there a difficult time in the pairing session, and just kind of being able to reflect in that way.
So you also say here that you had a pairing interview as a junior dev that didn't go very well. Do you want to talk about that and where you are in comparison with that
Yeah.
today?
So it was for ThoughtWorks actually, where they were suggesting different ideas around testing, but also around formatting, because I think at the time I was very haphazard in my pairing style or in my coding style. So I think I was using the wrong case in the Ruby code. I think because I was probably using camel case when it should have, like, I think snake case is kind of the Ruby standard. I might flip them, but there was a lot of suggestions or correction. There were a bunch of corrections in that regard, and I just got like really upset about that, and kind of ended up not listening to like anything one of the interviewers was saying, because like I was like, why are they commenting on my like coding style? This is so dumb and pointless. Like, it's all about the code you implement and not anything about the styling or the look. And that was kind of where my headspace was at the time, and just like thinking about like wow, like, this is not a good way to react in an interview. And I didn't like exactly say those things, but I think it was very clear because they asked about it when in like the follow-up to the interview, and like and then ended up giving them a perception that I wasn't listening to that person. So like what I having a problem with that person and with her in general, and like that made me feel really bad about realizing like I'm like, oh shit, like that could have like I gave off a way different vibe than I was meaning to. And also that like not being receptive to that. Sure, like maybe it's not like the highest value feedback, but there's still definitely a need for like a common styling is a thing that like if you don't have that, then you're going to have those conversations forever. And that's why stuff like Rubocop exists, to kind of at least give some kind of safety rails, so that we're not having the commas versus tabs versus spaces levels kind of discussion.
So how did you rescue from that? Did you just kind of
Yeah, I kind of like apologized and was like that was like the first start of that growth of like realizing like, oh, like just because they were giving commentary and I should have acknowledged it at least, even if I wasn't going to like. And I think there was enough of the recovery in the rest of the interview that I ended up actually still getting the offer, but I definitely think that was like a contention point, I imagine, and why they took a while to get back to me.
Sure. Sounds like you came a long way from there though.
Yeah, and I definitely think again, like being able to understand like right, like being able now to be at the space where I'm like, okay, let's give you the hour to try that thing out, or being like, okay, cool, like yeah, that's let's do that style fix. And at this point, I'm a very kind of hands off kind of person, where there are some certain high level things that I will be picky about, and definitely want to make sure we're test driving things, but definitely around like naming, or like, oh, you think there's a better name for that? Great. Or I see you're not liking the name I made. do you have a better name? Let's do that. Like, I'm happy to like just change the name of this file or this feature or this class, because if you can give a more intention revealing thing, like, please help me. And trying to like identify those pain points and help the other person kind of move along on their journey. Because I think that's, again, and that part of the being able to have a lot of personal growth was just being able to be adjacent to a lot of senior devs pairing and being able to like see, those are the shortcuts. Like, just nobody ever talks about shortcuts, right? Or like little compute little like those little life hacks. It's like you don't explicitly go out to look for those, but like in pairing, you just get to see what other people do that's like, oh, cool, I'm going to be using that shortcut now, or cool, like that like technique is like something that I will now start using in my own development.
Yeah, I think if nothing else, pair programming for coming up with names and methods or classes is pretty awesome. So I think that's one of the hardest part of programming is coming up with a relevant name for something.
Yeah.
Naming and caching, right?
And if you're in the DevOps side, DNS.
Oh, yeah.
So you have some interesting anecdotes down here too. One of the things that you note that I think is definitely not even a problem. I'm sorry, it's definitely a problem, regardless of whether you pair program or not, is basically kind of dealing with, you say here, design tensions and working with people who plan differently than you. That's totally a thing, like regardless of whether you're pair programming. How does pair programming make that easier for you or not?
I think it does a little bit because there are people that want to keep continuously refactor and make really like design the perfect object, and then there are people like me who kind of just like, what's the simplest thing that works? What can I ship right now that'll make the customer happier and be like happy with whatever result we get? And so being able to like have different people in the room kind of to get kind of more closer to like the combination of like where it's not breaking fast, not running fast and breaking things, but running fast and shipping cool things, just that it helps, I think, with that extra level of like getting to a more complete solution to the problem. Certainly there's definitely still tensions with that, and still definitely can be like, I think it can get a bit to be a problem if you like end up telling a story about what the other developer is thinking instead of actually double checking what they're thinking. But yeah, the fact that like when you're pairing that like whatever decision you're making, you need to get another person on board, I think helps. I think with a little bit of checks and balances, whereas versus in the a discussion can just get heated and very abstract. Whereas like when you're pairing, you're always like you're actually trying to get the next piece of work done.
Yeah, you've already started to create a coalition, or you know what I mean, a collective decision kind of is starting to happen. That makes sense.
Was there anything else that we should talk about, or is that pretty much all there is with pair programming?
I think something interesting is like the hiring process, because like not everyone pair, like I think I don't know what the statistic numbers are on it, but definitely like when I've gone to like pairing enthusiast, like while it's definitely evolved since like since the beginning of XP, it's still pretty not a super common practice, and definitely like full time not like a common practice for sure. And so just kind of interesting to see, okay, like both like the accidentalness of happening to find full-time shop to full-time shop, but also like hiring it like Automata Health, like where I used to work for, they like basically were trying to triple their engineering team, and trying to do that while maintaining like a pairing environment sounds like it's so fascinating, like because like they're definitely having to hire non-pairers. And sure, there's like a certain level of ability for like a certain level of number of senior devs to onboard new people onto a pairing style, but it feels like that's going to be like a thing that will cause like a cultural problem shift, where if you brought enough non-pairers onto the team, they're going to also not want to pair all the time.
So did you see that out to the end and see what happened?
No, I'm still waiting for updates. Unfortunately,
Okay.
I did not.
Jury is still out.
Jury's still out. I am surprised though. Something that is so. At first, people were like, "Oh, there's not pairing resources," and I was like, and I had told myself the narrative that there's not pairing resources out there. But I definitely like in researching for this conversation, there's like a lot of stuff out there now. At least what I was starting to see, like those like the ThoughtWorks pairing best practices, and I've seen some other best practices like the tuple guide. There's definitely some really good guides out there now for like bringing people up to speed on like the terminology and like some of the common problems and common misconceptions.
I feel people are more receptive to it too, right? Even even in cases where people don't want to use that as a predominant tool, people are like, oh, it's a legit tool that I can have in my back pocket.
Yeah,
as a minimum, I feel.
It's kind of funny because when we talk about pair programming, the idea of pairing with someone else to accomplish a single task, it's not unheard of in other industries. Just go get your oil changed on your car at one of the 15-minute oil change places. You have one guy underneath the car draining the oil, another guy on the top side doing the level checks of your other fluids and stuff. So, I mean, it exists out there in the wild. It just seems like I think Kent Beck originally coined the phrase pair programming, but he kind of introduced it into the development world.
Yeah.
Any stories you want to share or anything else that you feel like we're missing?
Definitely, yeah. It's definitely like a powerful tool, and certainly you don't need to be like, I love using it full time, but definitely recognize that it's it's definitely not necessarily always the tool for the task. So yeah, I think that's how I feel about it.
Well, Ian, if people want to follow what you're doing online or reach out to you, where should they go?
I do have a Twitter, Prophet BRTHA, and then also I'm working on a cats game, and I've got a link to that, the community resource below, and yeah, I think and I've got a GitHub, so if you can reach out to me there too.
Awesome.
Have you ever felt like JavaScript is just everywhere? Well, we have. We actually had a conversation on JavaScript Jabber about what you can build with JavaScript. We've also talked about what JavaScript is and how we're inspired by the language. If you're interested in JavaScript or doing web development, then you definitely need to check out JavaScript Jabber. You can find it at javascriptjabber.com.
All right, well, let's move on to some picks. John, do you want to start us out?
Yeah, I actually have 2 picks here. So I'm actually I have been all my life an avid book reader, and so I wanted to start going through some of the books or whatever, some recent and some that I haven't read in a long time, but I figured I would kind of like roll out with like my all-time favorite. So this is actually a whole entire book series or whatever that I read. I don't know. I probably read this like 10 years ago for the first time. Or I read the first book in it 10 years ago for the first time, and I didn't realize it was a series or anything like that. Anyway, but it's called Codex Alera, and I guess so. It's written by a guy named Jim Butcher, who writes some other stuff that I think he's pretty awesome, actually. But anyway, he wrote this series on a bet with a friend that he could write a book series. Basically, that his friend could give him 2 random topics, and he could write a book series. So his friend basically told him to write a book series on like the Romans and Pokemon. So as you like read the series, you could totally see where that kind of comes in or whatever. But it's one of the fastest like flowing book series that I've just ever read. It is a fantasy genre thing, but it just goes really fast. It feels like candy, but he's one of the better writers, I think, of our time. Like good character development. It's pretty complex, and you start out seeing like this really small view of the world, and it just kind of like grows through the whole big series. It's really cool. Anyway, so throwing that out there. And the second thing that I wanted to throw out there, so my son recently got into I don't know exactly why, but he's like 3.5. He decided he was interested in planets. So, we're checking out like every planet book there is from the library and all these things. Anyway, so, it's just throwing it out here for like simple toys, but like that paper towel roll is like an awesome telescope. And anyway, my son asked me to draw like all the planets on it, and I did. And that has been his favorite toy for like 3 weeks now.
Nice.
Yeah, I don't know. Whatever. It's fine. It's kind of cute. It's whatever, but like it cost me 30 minutes of my time to draw some circles. I'm not that good of an artist, and color them in. And yeah, anyway, just throwing it out there for simple toys.
Sweet. All right, I'll jump in with a couple of picks. In the spirit of pair programming, the one pick I'll pick for VS Code extension is called LiveShare, and it allows you to simultaneously work with multiple people using their own VS Code. So they have their own extensions, their own environment that they're familiar with, but you are simultaneously working off of one code base. So it's a really cool one. And my other pick is more of a life hack or a quick trick, but the backstory for this is my son recently discovered that sheetrock or drywall, if you throw something at it, it'll break it. And then you get all of this fun little dust stuff that comes out of it. So in his room, while he was taking a nap the other day, and keep in mind he's only 5, he put a hole in our drywall, and then he started to excavate it with his play tools. So the hole just kept growing bigger and bigger. And funny enough, he said, "Oh, Dad, that's been there for a long time." As I see like all the drywall dust like meshed into the carpet. Yeah. But I found this easy life hack on fixing drywall super quick, super fast. And it's been the best quality job. You essentially get a hole saw, you drill it into a spare piece of drywall, you then cut a square around that hole, and you just break out the excess drywall piece. So you still have that back tape. You wet it down, fill in the hole with some drywall putty on the wall. You put that on there and smooth it out, and it creates a seamless patch. So I will link a video on this guy on how he did it in the show notes. But yeah, it's definitely an amazing trick if you have kids.
Nice.
Ian, do you have any picks for us?
I think just for any kind of follow-up, the Martin Fowler article on pairing, I think is just a good follow-up read as far as the pick.
Well, Ian, I appreciate you coming on and talking with us today. And I guess we'll talk to you later.
Yeah, thank you. It was great.
Yeah, thanks.
We'll talk to y'all later. Bye.
Bye.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.